Three of the men accused of plotting the 11th of September 2001 attacks on the U.S. have entered into a pre-trial agreement, the Department of Defense says. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Walid Mohammed Salih Mubarak bin Attash, and Mustafa Ahmed Adam al-Hawsawi have been held at the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for years without going to trial. Details of the deal have not been announced, but U.S. news outlets say the men will plead guilty in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty. Nearly 3,000 people in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania were killed in the attacks, which sparked the War on Terror and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Brett Eagleson, the president of 9/11's Justice, an organization that represents 9/11 survivors and relatives of victims, said in a statement provided to the BBC that the families are deeply troubled by these plea deals. He said the process lacked transparency and urged the authorities to pursue more information on the role of Saudi Arabia in the attacks. Terry Strada, who lost her husband Tom, told the BBC's Today programme, "It was a gut punch to hear that there was a plea deal today that was giving the detainees in Guantanamo Bay what they want." Ms. Strada, the national chair of the campaign group 9/11's Families United, added, "This is a victory for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other two. It's a victory for them," she said. The 9/11's attacks were the deadliest assault on U.S. soil since the 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where 2,400 people were killed. The plea deal was first announced in a letter sent by prosecutors to the families of victims, according to the New York Times. It said the plea before a military court could come as early as next week. In its announcement, the U.S. Defense Department said the specific terms and conditions of the pre-trial agreements are not available to the public at this time. The men have been accused of a litany of charges, including attacking civilians, murder in violation of the laws of war, hijacking, and terrorism. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is widely considered the architect of the attack, in which hijackers seized passenger planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon outside of Washington. A fourth plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Mohammed, a U.S.-educated engineer, was captured along with Hawsawi in Pakistan in March 2003. Prosecutors argued that he brought his idea of hijacking and flying planes into U.S. buildings to al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, and later helped recruit and train some of the hijackers. He was subjected to a number of enhanced interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, simulated drowning, at least 183 times before the practice was banned by the U.S. government. The trial has been delayed for so long, partly because of fears that the so-called brutal interrogation techniques, which critics say amounted to torture, could have undermined the evidence against the detainees. "This is the least bad deal in the real world that would ever happen," national security analyst Peter Bergen told CNN. In September, the Biden administration reportedly rejected the terms of a plea deal with 5 men held at the U.S. Navy base in Cuba, including Mohammed. The men had reportedly sought a guarantee from the president that they would not be kept in solitary confinement and would have access to trauma treatment. The White House National Security Council said that the president's office was told on Wednesday of the new deal and had played no role in negotiations. 15 of the 19 plane hijackers were Saudi nationals, and families are bringing a lawsuit against the kingdom, which denies any involvement. Republicans were quick to attack the Biden administration for striking a deal with the accused. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell condemned the move as a revolting abdication of the government's responsibility to defend America and provide justice. "The only thing worse than negotiating with terrorists is negotiating with them after they are in custody," he said. What happened on 9/11? On Tuesday, the 11th of September, 2001, suicide attackers seized U.S. passenger jets and crashed them into 2 New York skyscrapers, killing thousands of people. The attack remains one of the most traumatic events of the century, not only for Americans, but also for the world. What were the targets? 4 planes flying over the eastern U.S. were seized simultaneously by small teams of hijackers. They were then used as giant, guided missiles to crash into landmark buildings in New York and Washington. Two planes struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The first hit the North Tower at 8:46 Eastern Time, 12:46 GMT. The second crashed into the South Tower at 9:03. The buildings were set on fire, trapping people on the upper floors and wreathing the city in smoke. In less than 2 hours, both 110-story towers collapsed in massive clouds of dust. At 9:37, the third plane destroyed the western face of the Pentagon, the giant headquarters of the U.S. military just outside the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The fourth plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 after passengers fought back. It is thought the hijackers had meant to attack the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. How many people died? In all, 2,977 people, not counting the 19 hijackers, lost their lives, most of them in New York. All 246 passengers and crew aboard the four planes were killed. At the Twin Towers, 2,606 people died, then or later, of injuries. At the Pentagon, 125 people were killed. The youngest victim was 2-year-old Christine Lee Hansen, who died on one of the planes with her parents Peter and Sue. The oldest was 82-year-old Robert Norton, who was on another plane with his wife Jacqueline, en route to a wedding. When the first plane struck, an estimated 17,400 people were in the towers. Nobody survived above the impact zone in the North Tower, but 18 managed to escape from the floors above the impact zone in the South Tower. Citizens of 77 different countries were among the casualties. New York City lost 441 first responders. Thousands of people were injured or later developed illnesses connected to the attacks, including firefighters who had worked in toxic debris. Who were the attackers? An Islamist extremist network called al-Qaeda planned the attacks from Afghanistan. Led by Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda blamed the US and its allies for conflicts in the Muslim world. 19 people carried out the hijackings, working in 3 teams of 5 and 1 of 4 on the plane which crashed in Pennsylvania. Each group included someone who had received pilot training. This was carried out at flying schools in the US itself. 15 hijackers were Saudis, like bin Laden himself. 2 were from the United Arab Emirates, 1 was from Egypt, and 1 was from Lebanon. How did the US respond? Less than a month after the attacks, President George W. Bush led an invasion of Afghanistan, supported by an international coalition, to eradicate al-Qaeda and hunt down bin Laden. However, it was not until 2011 that US troops finally located and killed bin Laden in neighboring Pakistan. The alleged planner of the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was arrested in Pakistan in 2003. He has been held in US custody at Guantanamo Bay since then and is still awaiting trial. Al-Qaeda still exists. It is strongest in sub-Saharan Africa, but even now has members inside Afghanistan. US troops left Afghanistan this year after nearly 20 years, stoking fears from many that the Islamist network could make a comeback. The legacy of 9/11s. Flight safety was tightened around the world in the years following 9/11s. In the US, the Transportation Security Administration was created to beef up security at airports and on planes. It took more than 8 months to clean up Ground Zero, the site of the fallen Twin Towers. A memorial and a museum now stands on the site, and buildings have risen up again to a different design. The completed centerpiece, One World Trade Center, or Freedom Tower, stands even higher, 1,776 feet, 541 m, than the original North Tower, which was 1,368 feet. Reconstruction at the Pentagon took just under a year, with staff back in their offices by August 2002. In a courtroom just feet away from 9/11 suspects, this grim anniversary has meant renewed focus on the 5 suspects in detention accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks. The men, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, have all appeared in court in Guantanamo Bay this week after an 18-month hiatus in pre-trial hearings caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Behind the glass in the viewing gallery have been a small number of relatives of victims of the attacks, some members of non-profit organizations, and a handful of journalists, all there to observe proceedings. Guantanamo Bay already feels cut off from the world, and given the magnitude of this case and weight of the horrific crimes being considered, the courtroom here feels all the more singularly alien. Walking into the courtroom for the first time was extremely emotionally powerful for me, says Dr. Elizabeth Berry, whose younger brother, Billy Burke, was one of the firemen in the North Tower when it collapsed. I wasn't quite sure what to expect because you see things in the newspapers, portrayals of the way people look, which are not really an accurate representation when you see them in the courtroom. It was very moving and very difficult, she says. Dr. Berry has attended many of the 42 pre-trial hearings in this case at Guantanamo Bay and says she specifically wanted to be here for the 20th anniversary of the attacks to feel she was supporting the team fighting for justice for her brother and nearly 3,000 others. I felt what better place to honor my brother than here with other family members. And with this, the prosecution team, she says. A trial like no other, it was noticeably difficult for most in the gallery to stop glancing, sometimes staring, at the defendants throughout the sessions. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, diminutive and with a henna-dyed orange beard, bounded into the courtroom the first morning to his seat beside his legal team. He and the 4 other defendants talked throughout much of the proceedings, either to their legal teams or to each other. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would often turn around for long periods, draping an arm over the back of his chair and chatting to Walid bin Attash, the defendant sitting directly behind him. The man believed to have conceived of the idea of the 9/11 attacks and overseen their planning, in animated discussion with one accused of training 2 of the hijackers. By their feet, it was noticeable that each of the 5 defendants had a large plastic tub filled with papers and files that they would often delve into. They've got all sorts of things in there, says Alka Pradhan, a lawyer representing Ammar al-Baluchi, who is alleged to have provided logistical support to 9/11 attackers, including through money transfers. They've got legal motions they want to talk to us about. They've got printouts from advocacy websites. Ammar, for example, will often ask us to print out recent material from his ongoing campaign with Amnesty International so he can discuss it, says Ms. Pradhan, indicating just how engaged all 5 defendants are in the direction their legal cases take. It is striking that many of the women that form part of the defense teams of the 9/11 suspects, like Alka Pradhan, wear the hijab in the courtroom in the presence of their clients. Some even cover themselves in an abaya, which they remove in sessions during which the defendants are not present. I do it in the courtroom because several of the guys were tortured specifically by females in very specific ways. The intentional sexual humiliation by women, says Ms. Pradhan. You can see a difference in the way they talk to you when you put the hijab on. It's not that they refuse to talk to me if I wear a hijab, and it's not that they have ever said you must wear hijab, but there is a difference in the way they interact with me, she says. I'm glad they're so well taken care of. The 9/11 suspects are not shackled in the courtroom. They were not made to wear masks like everyone else, and their legal teams are allowed to bring them clothing deemed culturally appropriate and even paramilitary-style dress. This week, for Ramzi bin al-Shibh, the man believed to have organized one cell of the 9/11 attackers that included a camouflage jacket of the type Osama bin Laden often wore, and that his fellow defendants, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, have worn in hearings in the past. I'm glad they're so well taken care of, says Elizabeth Berry, of the men accused of playing a part in the death of her brother, though the hurt she feels at seeing the defendants is abundantly clear. I think we do take very good care of these guys, and it's obvious they get better healthcare than I get, but it's all part of the process. It's part of accepting that this is what has to happen in order for it to come to a resolution, says Dr. Berry. Resolution seems a very long way off. After all, a start date for the trial of these men has yet to be set. This week we heard defense teams question the very basis of the process here, given that the 9/11 suspects will be tried not in civilian courts, but military commissions, suggesting they cannot be accused of committing war crimes because there was no war, and as such, a military commission is not appropriate. The question of torture, the issue of torture, and the US authorities' secrecy about its use also continues to cast a long shadow over proceedings, with arguments about what evidence is admissible given what the defendants were subjected to at Guantanamo Bay and so-called black sites elsewhere. There is no way to have a fair trial at this point if we are going to continue this charade, says Ammar al-Baluchi's lawyer, Alka Pradhan. We have hundreds of motions still pending, all because the government at every juncture has said they are not going to give us basic information about where the guys were held, who talked to them, what questions were they asked, and in what way, she says. It is exasperating for the families of victims of the attacks that progress continues to be so slow 20 years after the attacks. The United States is not on trial. The terrorists are, says Elizabeth Berry after the end of the final pre-trial session of the week. I get frustrated, especially when I hear that we've lost family members who've never seen, have never had resolution to this, but I'm optimistic because we've started again and we're moving forward. Subscribe for more updates. Thanks for watching.